Hello and welcome to today's Share webinar with Rocket Software, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, how businesses can stay secure, mitigate risk, and prevent security breaches, presented by Julie Bergh, Worldwide Lead Security Advisor at Rocket Software. My name is Bristol Cook, and on behalf of Share Headquarters, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Share is pleased to continue our webinar programming with this educational event. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available following the webcast on our Share website. All attendees will be muted throughout the webcast, and we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A box on your webinar toolbar. These will be addressed at the end of the presentation. I would now like to turn the webcast over to Julie.
Thank you, Crystal. And as Crystal said, we're here to talk about how businesses can stay secure, mitigate risk, and prevent security breaches. Now let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. When you think of a lot of this with what's going on in the world right now, authentication is really what's at the heart of security. So it really is about finding out who you are, and it really is going to answer that question, some of the things we're going to talk about today. And it's even become more critical in the recent events with everybody working from home, working remotely, and accessing your mission-critical applications within your environment. So when you think about more so than ever, businesses, government entities really need to make sure that they're protecting the mission-critical information that's out there and applications and ensuring who they are. So one of the things we'll talk about is how, you may want to think about deploying multi-factor authentication to stop hackers and protect your assets, using analytics and cognitive computing to detect vulnerabilities and remediate exposures, and supporting cloud and big data applications. And again, when you think about this, it's all about detecting threats, making sure you know who they say they are, and protecting your assets for your corporations. So one of the things we're talking a little bit about is today's environment, and it really is kind of what's happened in the last several months. And some statistics that were run by IBM X-Force is that 3.5% of employees that worked from home prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, that was 105 million workers. And when you think about 50 plus is the unique malware distributed in various COVID-19 themed campaigns. One of the things that are out there, as the X-Force had talked about, is they saw a jump of like 14,000%. And yes, that is the correct number, 14,000%, and just a lot of phishing, etc. with that. So being vigilant is more important than ever. The increase, 4,700 increase of related spam and malware activities. And from what they did with the survey is really expect a time frame to have some sense of form of social distancing playing in effect is probably going to be like 24 months. And this is, again, a survey that IBM X-Force and research had done in the environment. So when you think about these numbers that are out here, what is really the new normal? So prior to all of this, 42% of the employees now have never worked from home, and that was a CNBC All-America survey that's out here. So when you think about that, of the people that are working from home or working remotely now, 42% of those have never worked from home. 67% of employees will support the decision to mandate employees to work from home indefinitely, and that was a Glassdoor survey that was out there. 74% of CFOs intend to move at least 5% of their on-site employees to permanent remote basis, and that was a Gartner survey as of March 30th. And 40 to 50% of manufacturers' workforce will be unavailable to perform functions on-site, and that was an industry weekly survey that was done out there. And again, these are just some of these, what is the new normal that's taken place in the last several months that are out here. So when you think about that, and why this is important from an authentication standpoint is based on a Forrester report of privileged access management, 80% of security breaches involve a weak or stolen privileged credential. Privileged credential could be some, just really is somebody has gotten access to things, somebody has stolen your credentials, etc. And 85% of cyber attacks are entered through a compromised endpoint. So when you think about this and why this is important, when Verizon has done the data breach investigation reports, they say that over 70% of employees reuse passwords at work. And when you think about all the passwords that you're being asked to use now, whether it's just at work, your personal accounts, one of the questions I always ask customers is, are you using the same password for anything? So if you are, think about it. If I gained access to one of those, then chances are I may have access or your password for your account that's in your environment. So you really want to think about what you're doing with that, with your passwords, with your authentication that's out there. And because the majority of people really do reuse their passwords. I don't, unfortunately, and I'm always forgetting my passwords because I have these different accounts that are out there. I'm usually doing that, click the reset button because I can't remember what my passwords are. So when you think about what you need to be doing, the other thing to think about is don't have easily passwords to hack, like your favorite sports team, your pet's name, etc. I actually saw somebody that said, oh, I've changed my password to invalid because when I forget it, that tells me what it is because it says your password's invalid. Again, don't reuse them. Don't think of simple passwords that could be easily compromised that are out there. And when an analysis of 5 million leaked passwords showed that 10% of those people used one of the 25 worst passwords. And some of those, and recently there was just National Password Day, and a lot of them really are as the KWERTY from the keyboard that's out there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, password, etc. When you think about that, again, 10% of the people are using one of the 25 worst passwords that are out there. And 7% of enterprise users use extremely weak passwords in your environment. So thinking about it, it only takes one hacker, somebody else to do that to be able to compromise your system. And then one of the other things you think about is, are you that person that, especially when you were at work, but you take your password to your monitor, it's under your keyboard, etc. So, don't write them down, don't make them visible. In one of the surveys that were out there, it said 65% of business managers recorded their passwords on a private document in a Post-it note or something. Think about what you're doing, protecting your environment against hackers that are out there. Again, going back to the abstract of this, being all about authentication is an important factor in all of this happening. So when you think about this and the cyber attacks that are out here and just what is happening in general in the environment, there's been surveys that have been out there and done, and when you think about what's at stake, there's going to be 22 billion things that you possibly need to secure. When you think of the IoT devices that are out there, when you think of just even the computers that are in your automobiles, think about all this information. There's 33 billion personal records stolen, and 6 trillion is lost annually to cybercrime that's out there. And when you think a lot of that, what's happening in your environment, what's really going to happen and change? And when you think about this is look at the fines that are out there. When GDPR came out talking about billions of dollars that could cost a company in their environment if they were impacted. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but also the skill shortages from not being able to fill security jobs that are out there. And then just in general, what customers are looking at a lot of these things is there's a lot of tools from different vendors. How do you make sure that they're all working together, helping you do what you need to do, and not possibly provide an exposure in that need as well. So when you think about all these things that are out here, this is going to continue to work against you in your environment. And then when you think about this, going back to that authentication, but then once you're taking this a step beyond, is data privacy regulations. And trying to keep up with this chart is next to impossible because more and more things are out there in the environment from a privacy regulation. You know, there's CCPA in the United States. You can see some of the ones, you know, that general data privacy law in Brazil. Everybody talked about the GDPR. I'm not going to go over through a lot of these, but again, these are some of the more prevalent ones that are out there. And a lot of times when I talk to customers, they kind of go, you know, it doesn't matter to me, I'm in industry X. But when you think about it, there are regulations, data privacy within just about every industry that's out there. So when you think about from a financial services aspect that's out there, you know, you may need to comply with GDPR, the New York DFS 500 that's in place, maybe some of those that are out there. Not going to spend a lot of time going into the detail, but getting you to think about this is really impacting all industries. When you think of healthcare organizations, think about what they're dealing with. I mean, when you think about the volumes of patient information that they've got out there, recording that, having all that information that's out there, they're a clear target because remember several years ago when everybody was, and I was one of those people, it seemed like every week I was getting a notice that my credit card number had been compromised. Well, that's not as important anymore. Now it's like things like healthcare insurances, because if I have patient medical information, I've got a lot of history on what that person is really doing. So I've got social security numbers, I've got health, I've got a lot of personal information that's out there. And you really want to make sure that that information is protected and not exposed to areas. When you think of the government entities, state, in local, city, etc., when you think of all of that from data regulations, privacy, information that may be out there, you think about it from like the United States, you know, the group that takes care of your passports that are out there, making sure there's a lot of sensitive information that's out there. You need to be wary of data privacy, authentication information that's out there in the environment. When you think of the utilities, the energy and electricity, you think of those being able to secure those infrastructures that are out there, making sure that they're not vulnerable to attacks from any kind of people that are out there. Retail and consumer goods, you know, making sure that, you know, you're not impacting security. You know, there's been several retail industries, consumers that have taken it, been very, had their brands tarnished because of what's happened in their environment, because somebody's hacked into their environment. The telecom, the media, the entertainment industries, when you think of that, thinking about making sure that that communication is secure in your environment. Travel and transportation, thinking about that. You know, looking at that, I realize not everybody's traveling right now, but when you want to make sure that it's secure, it's not vulnerable to attacks that are out there in your environment, as well as even the automotive industry, and I talked briefly about that. As you know, when you think about the newer cars that are out there, all the different information, the things that it can check in the environment or check in the car, you know, they have to hook it up to a computer, you know, just all that information, as well as just even manufacturing companies. And I wanted to bring some of this up because a lot of times when I talk to customers, they kind of go, I'm in industry X, it's not as important to me. It really is important to you when you think about all these different industries that I just talked about. What's really happening in your environment? How do you want to make sure that this is secure? So when you think about this, what does this really have to do with the mainframe? Well, you know, mainframes really aren't going anywhere when you think about it, and I've done presentations about, have you talked to your mainframe lately, right? Have you gone to an ATM? Have you traveled on an airplane or some other mass transit? Have you know, your bank, your health insurance company, you know, chances are you've touched a mainframe that's out there, and it really is controlling a lot of that data that's out there in the environment. And they aren't going away anytime soon. And you want to make sure that these environments are secure. The mainframes are built to both be securable, reliable, scalable. And I say securable because There are a lot of things. The mainframe's been around for 55 plus years. You need to make sure that you're doing things that is secure, because the mainframe is touching a lot of different entities now in your environment. You think of just even your smartphone apps that you may have, maybe going back and actually talking to a mainframe. So when you think about some of this in the mainframe, 44 of the top 50 banks, government agencies, healthcare organizations, 10 of the top 10 insurers run their applications on the mainframe. And these are a survey has been done by Forrester Consulting. 64% of enterprise surveyed run more than half of their critical applications on the platform. And that's up from 57% a year. So when you think about it, the mainframe is not going away anywhere. And 72% of customer-facing applications at these enterprises are very reliant on the mainframe. I was actually talking to a customer recently, and they talked about how everything in their business is really running on that mainframe, contrary to what people may think that's happening out in the environment. And as you think about it, just all the things that are happening out there, more and more applications are being put on that mainframe. So you want to make sure that that mainframe is secure, and you're checking what's going on with your applications that are out there. And then that kind of goes hand in hand is with all that data that's going to be out there, how do you protect your most critical assets that are out here? When you think of it, mainframes run 30 billion transactions per day. They hold 80% of the world's business data and handle 90% of the credit cards. And there's actually one statistic that I had done in a presentation one time that talked about what happens in the internet, or not within the internet, but what kind of happens in a cybersecurity minute. And one of the things to think about is on the mainframe there's 1.3 million CICS transactions per second per day. And that's kind of comparing to not anywhere close to like something like Google that's out there in your environment. So think about what's happening in there and what's handling that access that's out there. And when you think about this, you want to make sure that you're securing your environment and making sure that remote users or anything you're doing is not introducing a new set of security challenges in your environment. So I've kind of talked a little bit about why the mainframe is there, things you need to think about protecting your critical assets. But one of the things I really talk about and is everybody has this perception that the mainframe is secure. So I really don't need to worry, right? And a lot of people still perceive that mainframe is a closed system. It's kind of like contained in a cabinet. It's behind closed doors. Nobody can really get at it. And when you think about the mainframe, it's been around for 55 plus years. And if you see older movies on TV as an example, it's back behind this glass window or something like that. But what you need to think about is, yes, the mainframe is secure, but it's really the most secureable platform. The mainframe's come a long way in 55 years that are out there. There are things you need to do to keep current on it to make sure that that platform is the most secureable that's out there. There's continuing things that are out there you want to monitor to make sure that you're not doing anything. When you think about this, if people are trying to get into this system, the mainframe in some respects is just like this really large server. And hackers or anything, they think of the mainframe is just simply this other large server that I'm going to try and get information on or get to it that's out there. And the things you think about, as I talk to customers a lot, is what are you doing, making sure that that environment is secure and not trying to get into that application that's out there. So as you think about this, when you're going through as a company, you may be going through the digital transformation that's out there, you really want to think about what am I doing to make sure that that mainframe is secure, because it's not secure by default. I get a new mainframe, I get it in the door, it's not secure by default. I've got to do something with it. It's kind of like your house. I've got a door in my house, but if I don't lock the door, my house isn't necessarily secure because somebody could come in. You've got to secure the mainframe environment against potential bad actors that may be coming into your environment. So when you think about this, And again, the mainframe is more connected than ever. You know, contrary to what everybody's thinking about, it's just out there doing something. But when you think about mobile applications, I talked about application programming interfaces, the cloud, IoT, the Internet of Things devices that are out there, social, data, blockchain, etc. It really is more connected than ever to the environments, the things that we're doing in our day-to-day life that's out there. And when you think about this, that landscape of what's really happening with the mainframe, part of this is really that user authentication that's out there. And what am I really doing? Because really, you know, it's not that contained in a secure location anymore. It is in a secure location, but that perimeter of what the mainframe really is really kind of vanished or becoming very cloudy. And you need to make sure that you're doing everything that people are going to come into this environment or who they say they are in the environment. And again, because historically the mainframe has been kind of isolated from the internet, but you want to make sure that you are secure and doing everything possibly to make things happen in your environment. So one of the things as I start talking to customers a long time is I start thinking about questions you may want to ask yourself at a high level. You know, what kind of risk? How do you prove that users haven't jeopardized the integrity of your financially or sensitive data that's out there? And, you know, what are you doing? And a lot of times, you know, I've got to also make sure that I'm securing that infrastructure. Because even though I've got applications that are out there, I need to make sure that that infrastructure, i.e. that mainframe, the operating system, is secure. And how do I compile reports for auditors that are really showing that, you know, things are secure, you know, I'm monitoring this, I'm taking proactive action. A lot of times I talk to customers, oh yeah, I've got reports, I only look at them when I need to look at them, and or if there's some kind of problems that are out there. And when you think about that, what do you do if something does really happen in your environment? So when you think about this, is how do you prove in your environment that somebody who's trying to access some of this resource out there is who they say they are? And when you think about a lot of this as part of this risk, the cost, the security, is that identity really is that foundation of what's happening when you get into your system. You know, who am I? How do I identify myself to the environment? And that really is something that we call is the authentication, kind of the basis as we started talking about all this earlier on. And when you think about this, how am I going to do this to really prove who I am that's going to try and get into this environment that I want to? Which really brings up that question is how do you ensure users are who they claim to be? And when you think about this, it's really that authentication and really authenticating a user before allowing them access to that application is really that very crucial aspect that's going to happen in your environment. And historically, it really is the username, user ID, and password that most people use to get into their environments. But you as a consumer, even when you think about what's happening in your environments today, it's just your own personal things, whether it's getting at your health insurance or, you know, the doctors, your banks, a lot more you're being asked to do more than just have a user ID and password. So you want to think about what am I doing? And talking with a lot of customers, a lot of times people have poor what I call password hygiene practices. You know, again, I talked a little bit about reusing passwords, using the same one, making them easy to guess, etc. You know, things you need to think about, make sure that who are the people ensuring that they really are who they claim they are. And one of the things that I saw really interesting is there was a 2019 state of password and authentication behaviors, and it was done by Ubico, and I've got the URL on this page. But when you think about this and look at some of these statistics, 69% admit to sharing passwords with colleagues for access to accounts. Wow, thinking about that, right? If I give somebody else my user ID and password and I'm sharing that to give them access to an account that's out there, you know, how do I know that they haven't done something else beyond that? 51% reuse an average of 5 passwords across business accounts and personal accounts. So again, going back to the comment of, if I use the same password on my personal accounts, if somebody happens to get that and they happen to know I work for company XYZ, maybe there's a chance that this is the same password for getting into that environment. 55% do not use two-factor authentication at work or multi-factor authentication at work. I'm going to talk a little bit about that coming up. 67% do not use any form of two-factor in their personal life. So you start thinking about, and you've heard about identity thefts that are out there, you're not even doing a lot of that within your personal life. But the good news is people more and more are becoming concerned about privacy and practice in their personal life. That was a 63% number that is out there, which is really good. Think about what you're doing to secure your environment. So you think, again, this is a UBCOPE state of authentication behaviors. I found it very interesting to think about this. And again, we think about cyber attacks that are out there. They're becoming more prevalent all the time. What are you doing to make sure that you're secure in the environment? So let's start about this. And it really all starts back to what we talked a little bit about half an hour ago. It really all starts with authentication. I'm going to log in and I'm going to have a user ID and password. Or do I put my password and tape it on the top of my screen that's out there? You really need to think about what you're doing to make sure that you're securing that environment. And there was an article that was out there, and it was called The Death of the Password. And really, it really hasn't gone away. It's still out there, very active. It's out there. And when you think about things that can be tied to your accounts and, getting, things like, your personal information, you want to make sure that that information is secure all the time. So you need to think about other options that you may be using to make sure that your environment is secure. And passwords really are a simple point of attack for hackers that are out there. You go out there and you just kind of even Google some of that stuff, and you can go out there and there's, dictionary hacks or different things that are out there. I've attended conferences where there's a machine that say, hey, go and enter a password, let's see how long it takes for us to crack it. So when you think about it, you need to be able to do something to enforce authentication in your environment and make sure that you're doing that across the environment that's out there. So one of the things, IBM X-Force in 2020, Christopher Scott really was talking about, and he's a leader in the X-Force Center. Multi-factor authentication is really a must in today's world. And the FBI has been quoted saying, continues to be a strong and effective security measure to protect against accounts. And when you think about it, is 80% of initial entries into victims' networks were previously stolen credentials that are out there. Think about what you're doing, what people are doing, how are you telling people if they're just using user IDs and passwords, or if I'm doing, not doing anything as far as making the passwords more challenging. One of the recent studies it showed that 1 in 5 people were willing to sell their passwords in the United States that was averaging around $20,000. And I've actually met with customers where they've gone in and they said that this has happened to them, where somebody has sold their credentials to somebody else that's out there. And people, as you think about it, you recycle through your passwords, right? Maybe it's password 1 today, and when I have to change it tomorrow, it's called password 2. What are you really doing to make sure that you're securing that environment out there? And again, I talked a little bit about password cracking. And really, when you think about this from the mainframe aspect, that has been out there for a very long time, is making sure that people really think about that mainframe and having to secure that from a multi-factor authentication. So one of the things that's really kind of come into play is multi-factor authentication. You heard me just mention something called two-factor authentication. It's basically the same that's out there. In its simplest forms, it's something you know, something you have, and something you are. So when you think about what that something you know is something, maybe a secret out there, a PIN, a zip code, your usernames, your passwords. But again, really, is that something that I have out there in my environment. The something you have is, it could be a badge, it could be a hard token, a soft token, one-time passwords that are out there. And then the something you are is really comes back down to that biometrics, How do I really do that? Is it facial recognition? Is it voice? Is it, fingerprint scanning, etc.? And what this really amounts to is I have to be using 2 or more of these to be multi-factor authentication. It's out here. I could be using all 3 if I wanted to, but I need to be using 2 or more of these to make them multi-factor authentication in your environment. So when you think about it, logging onto a system, I may have to enter my user ID and password, but I may have, as this example shows here, I may have to get some one-time passwords from a token that's out there, or maybe get a fingerprint to be able to go out and get some kind of code that's out there. Now, when you think about that's what multi-factor is, and you may think you're doing multi-factor, but what multi-factor isn't is, maybe as an example, a website asks you to do a user ID and password, but maybe asks you to answer some security-based questions like, what was your pet's favorite name, what's your mother's maiden name, etc. And then, sometimes this is stuff that maybe based on the credit report or something like that. This is not multi-factor. This is more of a 2-step process. So when you think about that, you may or may not be doing that. So help you understand a little bit about multi-factor authentication. And sometimes too, it's just kind of like maybe somebody sends me a text message and I have to enter that alongside my PIN or something that is considered more 2-step process versus multi-factor process. And again, multi-factor is really requiring to use 2 or more of those things that I talked about, something you know, something you have, and something you are, to authenticate with your environment. A lot of times when I talk to customers, they go, well, I only need to worry about privileged users for multi-factor authentication in my environment and getting into my mainframe environment. And that's really not true. When you really think about this, even more so than ever, is, you may have application programmers that are out there doing something. You may have, the people that are supporting the infrastructures. You may have vendors coming into your environment. You may have other third-party people coming into your environment. You may just have the employees that are out there coming into your environment. Think of it even like an example of like maybe a bank teller. They're logging on, they're going to do something. They're going to enter maybe my bank account to get at my information. Don't I really want to make sure that that person that's logging on is a bank teller that's getting into my account to maybe do a deposit or something like that is really who they say they are? Because a few years ago, a lot of people said, well, you really only need to worry about privileged user IDs. No, really, when you think about it, is if you don't want any of that data going out to the outside world to be released to the public, you really want everybody out there doing multi-factor authentication in the environment. Because again, I just talked about some of the statistics that are out there about people selling credentials and or using same passwords, etc. So thinking about that, you really want everybody to do that. And a lot of times when I talk to customers, they kind of go, well, I've got multi-factor out on the VPN, so when people come in, I've got it out there, I really don't need to worry about it even coming into the mainframe. But again, if you think about the statistics I talked about people hijacking accounts that are out there, selling accounts, I really want to be able to do communication as close to that resource as possible. That's what taking advantage of using multi-factor authentication on the mainframe is very, very important. So again, thinking about where you want it, if you don't want this data released, one of the statistics I talked about earlier in this call was about, from the damage it can do to your brand if something is compromised, and there have been retail industries that have suffered that because some of that information has gotten out there and been compromised. So we've talked a little bit about multi-factor authentication and why authentication is important, especially using multi-factor authentication. But let's take it to the next level now. And talking about now, I've done something for my multi-factor authentication, but what do I really need to do to maintain my data privacy and regulatory compliance? As I mentioned earlier, there's compliance regulations for various industries that are out there. I don't believe that there's one that doesn't have to worry about any of this. But again, when you think about this, this whole data privacy and regulatory compliance is really driving a lot of the mandates out there. If you think about this, and as I talk to customers now, a lot of companies have data privacy officers, et cetera, again, to protect this data that's out here. That first step was authentication to make sure it really is that person that's getting at that. But then I want to make sure that those people, what am I doing to protect that data in my environment? Because when you really think about it, that data is the lifeblood of your business. When you think of the things that you've seen out there, the damage that has caused to certain entities when they've been compromised, they will take a hit as far as a brand because of what's happened to your business. I spent the majority of my career out in financial institutions, and we used to know that if something happened, this is X percent would be a hit on our brand. So again, when you think about the data is the lifeblood of your business, you want to make sure it's secure. You want to know who's using it, when they're using it, and what they're using it, possibly using that data for. So when you think of that, kind of coming back to some of these statistics, did you know that 60% of data breaches are caused by negligent insiders and/or human errors? And this is coming from the cost of a data breach from 2019. And when you look at just as a number from a financial industry, the average cost is $5.86 million for that breach that's happening out there. I don't think a lot of companies can be able to take a $5.86 million cost as far as a data breach that's out here. And on the next chart, I've got a little bit more statistics breaking down into some of these things. So you really want to think about what it's going to take, for a brand image. Because this number that says $5.86 million is just the cost. This is not taking into consideration brand image or anything else like that. So you think about, what am I doing? Do I know where my sensitive data is? What am I doing to protect it? And how are people getting access to it? This kind of goes into a little bit more on the cost of a data breach. And this is just of a global average that's out here. And again, this is from a Ponemon study from IBM. The average breach size, and again, this is just an average, was 25,000 plus records that were out there. The cost per record was $150. But if you had more records than that, then you can think about that. The highest country average cost was the United States, which was $8.19 million. Look at the number, the time to identify and contain a breach, 279 days. That's a long time that's out there to think about what it's going to take to identify and contain a breach. And then the highest was the healthcare. And as I talked a little bit about that earlier, is, the healthcare industry, when you think about all the personal information that's got, you want to make sure that that area is, that your information is secure in your environment. So these are just some statistics that are out there. And these are increases over what's happened, like even in 2018, the average increase was 266 days to maintain a breach. And some of this is really about, what do I need to do to contain the breach, contain the breach, and make sure everything is back in place and okay after that breach has happened in my environment. So what are you really doing to safeguard your data wherever it resides? When you think about this, databases, files, data, keys, clouds, wherever your data that's out here, what are you doing to safeguard that data wherever it is? And a lot of people think about, well, it's just all about databases. But there's also all those other files that I may just have from a mainframe perspective. What am I doing to make sure that I'm monitoring that environment. And one of the things you think about is a lot of times data is maybe in a database, but it may be that unloaded at night to run through a batch process. So what am I doing to make sure that I can track, see what's happening, what's going on with that data in my environment, and protecting it from a holistic viewpoint in my environment. You know, looking at who's maybe touching at this, maybe classifying the data, looking for possible vulnerabilities, looking at maybe the risk analysis associated with this. What am I doing really to protect that in my environment? Because again, when you think about it, data is everywhere. And again, it can be replicated and deployed, traverse a lot of these. That's kind of really what this screenshot is talking about. It really can be everywhere, and it's growing at a very fast pace. So when you think about this from continuous compliance, you know, we talked about the cost of a data breach. You know, Google was fined 50 million euros for GDPR violations. You know, and of the 15 billion records that were breached since 2013, only 4% of them were encrypted. We talked some of the penalties from a HIPAA standpoint, and just some statistics about, you know, probability of an organization experience a data breach in your environment. So when you think about this, you know, I've kind of hinted at this. A lot of times you have limited visibility into your environment, fragmented control, slow reporting, or no reporting at all. You know, getting an idea to prioritize the risk. You know, what's it really going to take to do this? What am I really looking at it from a vulnerability standpoint? I've talked to many customers, a lot of them, you know, don't run reports, or they run reports, and unless something happens, I'm not going to look at these reports. And think about the number of days it just took to contain a breach if something happens. So when you think about this, a lot of times a lot of the information in your environment is siloed. And what are you really doing to make sure that you're managing that data, managing it from wherever that data may reside, looking at it? You know, how do you kind of track what Julie just did across the enterprise as far as what data that she may have gotten access to? And, excuse me. And then we think about it from the extent of where all that data may reside. What are you really doing to be very proactive in your environment? So one of the things you think about from you know, data privacy, you know, these are just some questions you can think about. You know, do you collect or process personal data? Do you collect or process personal data from different states or countries? Are you exporting the data? Are you allowing remote access to that personal data? Again, kind of going back to that authentication process. You know, what are you doing with that data? Where are you going to go with that data? One of the things I talk to with customers is you really need to adopt the least privileged access to this data. The days of, you know, we trust everybody and everybody can have all access to data is really long gone. You need to make sure that I only have access to the data that I really need to do my job, you know. Because if I can read something, I can copy it. And do I really want somebody to be able to copy that data and take it somewhere else? So when you think about what am I doing to maybe classify that data, understand where some of that data is at from a risk assessment standpoint, wherever it monitors, wherever it may reside, how am I doing to monitor that data that's out there, getting some insights. You know, how do I know if somebody's looking at and downloading 100,000 records from a database? Is that something that I need to be aware of? Is that normal? You know, what am I thinking about from that aspect? And then when you really think about it, it really is keeping that data-centric approach to what I need to be doing in my environment. So what am I really doing in my environment to protect against unauthorized access and comply with all the regulations that are being imposed on everybody? So you really want to protect it, obviously, from data breaches and fraud and the other internal and external access that people may get. And it's not just about privileged users, it's really about anybody that could get at this data. You really want to make sure that, you know, you're controlling access to that data, again, adopting that least privileged access in the environment. You want to make sure that I have some type of way to do real-time incident response for this, which is also, when you think about this, doing this and putting it up front, and yes, it takes a little bit of work to put some of this up front, you want to make sure that you're doing this because it reduces the cost of compliance in the long run. When you think about these, being able to automate, discover this, classify this data that's out here, helps you from your risk standpoint in your environment. And with that, I've kind of talked for like 45 minutes on just talking about multi-factor, protecting your data. And I kind of really want to summarize a little bit about when you think about some of these things. And when you think about it, you know, when you look at increased sensitivity, the regulations, complex systems, the rapid globalization that's happening now in the data governance, you really want to make sure that you understand what's happening from a data privacy aspect and how it's impacting your environment. You know, when you think about, you know, half the data breaches are caused by human error. What am I doing to maybe possibly control that? Again, maybe adopting least privilege. You know, a lot of times what I used to do in my previous jobs is you can go out and just see what you have access to that you probably shouldn't. And then that should be something that's triggering on a report that's out there. So thinking about what you're doing in your environment and how you're doing that from a compliance standpoint. In a previous career, I was actually an audit director for a large financial institution. What are you really doing to automate that process, making sure that you're in compliance? And again, it takes a little bit to set it up, but once you've got it automated, it goes a long way out there. And I found this chart very interesting, 152.91. And it really is, when you talk about it, it's the average blood pressure of today's CISO out here. And really, these are the things from a security leader's to-do list that you want to think about. Are they thinking about what they need to be doing? You know, looking at GDPR, you know, third-party risks, because it's not just you doing business by yourself anymore. You probably are dealing with a lot of vendors. They may be getting information for you. You know, how do you look at making sure that you have secured your environment, looking for possible vulnerabilities in your environment? Excuse me. And, you know, this is, again, just kind of from a security leader's standpoint. I thought this was an interesting chart to go out here and put from a CISO standpoint. And with that, I am capable of taking questions and answers right now.
Thanks, Julie. So we do have a few questions. The first one, how is multi-factor authentication different from multi-step authentication?
Great question. So multi-factor really involves two of the three things, that it's something you are, something you have, and something you know. And I have to have those, do at least two of those to make multi-factor authentication in place. Multi-step or two-step is really kind of like I log on to a website and it's asking me to enter my mother's maiden name or something else like that, because I'm really not doing anything extra to go out and get that. Or maybe something happens and it will send me like a text to my phone and then I enter that code. It's really a multi-step authentication process. It's not a multi-factor authentication process.
Fantastic. So the next question, why is insider threat even more potent during the pandemic than otherwise?
Great question. So when you think about what's happening, and going back to some of the earlier slides, and I don't remember the exact number, but more and more people, I think it said 42% more people are working remotely right now. So you're at home, you're looking at your environment, you know, I was always the type of person when I was in the office, if I got up and walked away from my computer, I locked my computer up. But if you think about it, if you're at home, you can maybe walk away from your computer, somebody could come up, not that anybody would do it, but again, a lot of this is remote. You want to make sure that people aren't doing anything, somebody hasn't hijacked your credentials. If you're doing things over a Wi-Fi, or maybe you've taken your laptop and taken it down to the local coffee shop, you know, that could be public information that's transferring over that. You really want to make sure that that environment is secure. And again, more and more people are working remotely right now because of the pandemic.
All right. So our next question, in our organization, we use RACF. Do we still need multi-factor authentication solution? And if so, how can they coexist?
Great question. And a lot of times customers go in and they kind of say, I do multi-factor out at my VPN level. So when you think about people working remotely right now, they may be logging into their company's environment, is I may be done multi-factor out there. But then once I get in, I may be doing something. I may be an applications programmer that needs to log on to the mainframe or something like that. And again, I talked about how getting stolen credentials, people selling their credentials, multi-factor authentication with RACF on the mainframe puts that level of authentication as close to the resource as possible, because that information can be held within like the RACF database.
We have a couple more questions. The first one, we use VPN to access the mainframe. Do we still need to worry about our security strategy?
Absolutely. Just because you've gotten in through your VPN and using multi-factor out there, once you're in, think about all the things that you can possibly access in your environment. You want to be able to make sure that environment's secure. Again, nobody has compromised your credentials, stolen your credentials. You really want to think about using multi-factor wherever you possibly can.
Okay, and our final question. We have users accessing data that shouldn't be released to the public. How do we protect their IDs?
Again, that's a really good use case for multi-factor authentication, because if I've compromised, if somebody guesses my password that's out there, good luck, because I can never remember my passwords. But you want to make sure that if they've got this data that you don't want released to the public, you really want to do something to monitor the data and or then also use that authentication process that's out there. I've had customers that when I've gone in and I've talked to them, you know, there's been IDs that have been used, and management usually has to sign off on them. But until you start looking at some of these things and be able to put them in a solution that will allow you to do behavior analytics analysis of this, you may not realize that, oh, this is happening every day at the same time. Why is this happening every day at the same time? So, you know, it's authentication is one step, but then also looking at and monitoring the data that's out there and possibly quarantine it or shutting something down. You know, should Julie be unloading 100,000 records from a database? If she should, that's okay. Maybe not. If she's doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning, chances are she probably shouldn't be doing it. But again, putting those kind of controls in place to be more proactive than reactive.
All right. Those were all of our questions. Thank you very much, Julie. That concludes today's webcast. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's event. Please take a moment to complete the quick feedback survey on your screen. We really appreciate your input. This feature will soon be available on the Share website. Thank you again, and please enjoy your day.